We often talk on this channel about various aspects of dyslexia. But what about what dyslexia is not? Hey everyone, we're Nick and Sonia, and this is Dyslexia Journey. Welcome. Today we want to talk about the topic of what dyslexia is not. So like I said in the intro, we often talk on this channel about what dyslexia is, going into various aspects and people's experiences with it. And we've even addressed to some extent some misconceptions, but we wanted to be very specific this time in talking about a few things that dyslexia is not.
Yeah, so to start with, dyslexia is not just reading words backwards or reversing letters or seeing words scrambled on the page. Now, sometimes you do hear about people who, often dyslexic kids will write letters backwards. So they'll write a D instead of a B, if we're talking about lowercase. But the sort of classic conception of dyslexia in the mainstream of it being either where everything's just scrambled up or where you're literally just reading backwards instead of forwards is really not the case for almost everyone who actually has dyslexia.
Well, and I want to dig into this a little more because we hear all the time when we're interviewing people and, talking to various people about being dyslexic. And I'm so you've probably heard some of this too. We will hear people say that they scramble up where they are on the page, for example, or maybe they, write the beginning of the word first at the end, switch the beginning and the end of the word, like in terms of when they're trying to write it, something like that. So it sounds like something like reading backwards or it being all scrambled up visually, right? But I think really the point here, it's not that those things don't happen. But the way I think of it is that not being dyslexic, it's almost like I just can't understand what they mean by that. So it's like, it's more complicated, you could say, or more like about the processing of all the information than it being what we sort of imagine that could be if we're trying to like understand, oh, it's scrambled, oh, it's backwards. So it's not that some of those things don't happen that look like it could be that. It's more that it's more about the processing and how that information is being interacted with in the brain.
Right, and the way that I've heard it described, for example, by someone with dyslexia recently is it's not like they said they can read individual letters, they can read individual words. It's more like when they try to read quickly, it's sort of the processing of it all, that then it becomes difficult to parse sort of the individual words. And so I think when people say it becomes scrambled, they don't literally mean that they can't focus on a specific letter or a specific word.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so it'll look different, I think, for different people, but also at different stages of learning to read, probably, how this type of thing would look. But the main point is when people just sort of categorize it very, very sort of simplistically as, the letters are backwards or it's scrambled, without understanding sort of there's more to it than that. I think that really is what dyslexia isn't.
Exactly.
The second thing that dyslexia isn't is a disease to be cured or fixed. And we've talked a little bit about this before on this channel because it's tricky again, because, there is a diagnosis often that is done for it, which one associates that word diagnosis with disease then, right? But it's, again, really this sort of deeper, more complex thing than that. We're talking about a kind of neurodiverse brain. We're talking about something that has positive characteristics and characteristics we consider more negative in terms of how schools and society are run and, how learning usually takes place. So there are challenges, certainly, but overall, it's not that it is a disorder or something like that.
Yeah, and to kind of emphasize one of the points that Sonia just made, it really is a whole brain difference that is never going to change. Like someone with dyslexia is never going to change their brain to be like someone who doesn't have dyslexia. or vice versa. Someone without
Mm-hmm.
dyslexia cannot change their brain to be like someone with dyslexia.
Exactly, which gets into that not being curable
Right.
idea, right? That doesn't mean that there aren't interventions to do to make learning happen more easily for all kinds of different reasons. There can be, interventions and aspects that are worked on, but it's not it's something to be cured. It's not that kind of a thing.
Right. Now, to be very clear, we don't mean that dyslexia cannot be remediated. So that's a very different thing. And what we mean by that is that people with dyslexia can learn to read and can learn to read fluently. But it's not, they will always have dyslexia. They will always have that underlying brain difference.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think, what's important to take from this, though, even knowing that, is that if you want to get resources and accommodations and things, you still have to go through the process of being identified. Mm-hmm. And, sometimes that's called being diagnosed. And that, interestingly, though, right, it's not done through a pediatrician. It's done through a special kind of psychologist, so educational psychologist, at least in the United States. And so that's just important to keep in mind. While even though we're saying this, that there's a piece of it that feels more like that as one goes through the journey of being identified.
Okay, so the third thing that it's important to emphasize that dyslexia is not an intellectual defect. So there are people with dyslexia people with dyslexia score, I guess, kind of across all ranges of an IQ test, just like people without dyslexia. Mm-hmm. It's not correlated with measures of intelligence.
Right.
That is very important to understand, and probably one of the most common misconceptions out there.
Right, and that's a little different from, understanding that sometimes, dyslexic people might be more likely to be good at art or something like that. Like, that's also true that there's other kinds of giftings other than what we think of as academic intelligence and things that we test for in an IQ test. But what we're saying here is that it's actually not even at all the same,
right,
as not having a higher IQ.
Right, and the reason,
in that context.
I mean, it's understandable why this confusion exists, because so much of our educational system and so much of the ways that we talk about intelligence are related to reading and writing. And so if someone with dyslexia is given exams or intelligence tests that involve reading and writing, they might not score as high as their kind of innate intelligence would allow them to, where they were given an equivalent test that did not involve that type of reading and writing.
Right, exactly. So the kind of testing matters to whether or not they can potentially show what's really being tested in those kind of IQ tests.
Right, and so this means that there are, in school, there are going to be dyslexic kids across all ranges of classes. I mean, there's going to be dyslexic kids in special ed. There's going to be dyslexic kids in honors classes. I mean, it's the same range.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it may, in practicality, like right now, especially with lots of people not being identified still, look like the numbers are lower. But it's definitely possible. Like it really shouldn't be that way. It should be that it's more an equal distribution. Yeah. Okay, so the fourth thing that dyslexia is not is rare. So estimates are often around 20% of the population that actually is dyslexic. I mean, it's not an exact measure, but often you'll see that as a 1 in 5 or 20% is kind of the what is guessed for what the actual prevalence is. Now, there's definitely a lot of cases, like I was mentioning, that aren't identified. So that can be some of what looks different. There can also be a range of how the dyslexia presents as to how mild or severe it looks. And that can be for a range of factors. It can be because, a kid maybe sort of came up with their own method and taught themselves to read a little more. And so therefore they didn't have as much of a deficit early on and to get behind in school. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why that can happen where someone isn't identified or it looks milder. But especially when I think this is easier to see when we think about the genetic aspect. So it's very much like is genetic, and you'll see patterns in families, that sometimes someone in a family like only is identified later, and then it's considered a milder dyslexia, but there's other people in the family who have more severe dyslexia. And, as far as I know, we haven't identified the genes for like really yet. So it's very possible that it's like multifactorial too, that it could be several different genes happening. So who knows why, like it's not always looking like it's as prevalent, but it really is. And so I don't think that is commonly out there, like still known that much. And the reason it's important is both that the general public understands that, but then also that people might consider having it, or, that someone they know has it like more easily.
Yeah. And to add to that, so sort of to make it more concrete. So if you're out there listening to this right now, you either have dyslexia yourself or know someone who has dyslexia. Like it is very likely that you know someone who has dyslexia because, as we said, approximately 1 out of 5 people have dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So our fifth and final point for today of what dyslexia is not. So dyslexia is not uniform. Everyone who has dyslexia is unique. And so everyone has slightly different things that they struggle with, slightly different things that they're good at, just like people without dyslexia. It doesn't show up the same way in any two people.
Mm-hmm.
So one person with dyslexia might not learn to read until they're 12. Another person with dyslexia might learn to read when they're 5. There's no consistency of that kind of course, how well people or kids do in school, etc.
And, some of that is also can be because of other, aspects of neurodiversity. Like it's not uncommon for someone who's dyslexic to also have ADHD. So there can be, there's so many other things going on, right, in someone's brain and in their life and their experiences, that it's just naturally going to affect something like being dyslexic, which is so like pervasive in terms of how learning and information processing happen, that's, I think, why there's so much variety really in terms of how it looks. But of course there are consistent patterns that allow us to identify someone who is dyslexic.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to add to that, to what Sonia just said, is that we don't know whether these differences are, more genetic or more environmental or a combination of both, most likely. But that the fact remains that people do exhibit it very differently.
Right. So hopefully that was helpful. These, in a sense, are some potential misconceptions around being dyslexic. So we just wanted to address those in this video. And if we forgot any, or if you notice any in your own life or the dyslexic person we'd love to hear about them in the comments. Thank you for watching.
Thanks.